Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into an incredibly fascinating and, honestly, highly debated topic. We're going to impartially break down what three major political commentators are saying about the shifting ground beneath India's ruling BJP. We're looking strictly at the data, the policies, and the public reactions they've highlighted. So buckle up, because we're going to explore the underlying causes of what these sources are calling a massive political transition heading into the 2029 elections.
But, to understand where we are right now, we really have to look at where we started. 303. That striking number represents the absolute peak of the Modi 2.0 era back in the 2019 elections. As our sources point out, this was a time of an unchecked, completely commanding majority. The vibe, the slogan, basically the whole narrative was that the leadership was this unstoppable force, just a completely unchallenged authority in Indian politics.
Fast forward to the 2024 elections and, bam, we get 240. This drop, falling 32 seats short of a simple majority, is exactly what the commentators universally pinpoint as the massive shock to the system. It's like a political earthquake. This single numerical shift is the primary catalyst for all the current political friction we're seeing, and it completely transformed the government's entire approach. Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our roadmap for today. We'll be looking at 5 specific themes synthesized directly from the creators' arguments. 1. The 2024 electoral shift. 2. Governance and youth issues. 3. The E20 fuel frustration. 4. Alienating the core base. And finally, 5. The shifting global image. So starting us off with Section 1, the 2024 electoral shift, from invincible to managerial. The sources draw a really sharp contrast here. If you look back at the Modi 1.0 and 2.0 eras, commentators literally describe that period as invincible. They were executing massive, historically complex decisions, like passing the triple talaq bill and abrogating Article 370 without batting an eye. But now, in the Modi 3.0 era, the data shows the leadership has been forced into much more of a managerial role. Why? Because they're suddenly relying heavily on coalition partners like Nitish Kumar and Chandrababu Naidu. The previous lightning speed? It's just gone. According to the analysis, when you see stalled legislation, like those recent university equity bills being sent off to joint parliamentary committees, that is proof that a government resting on a coalition simply cannot run at that same unchecked speed anymore.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how one of the Telugu commentators identifies 5 very specific foundational cracks that led to this massive shift. The analysis suggests that this immense anti-incumbency feeling built up due to a combination of things: controversies over Ram Mandir donations, nationwide exam paper leaks, this sudden E20 fuel transition, weakening economic metrics, where the middle class just isn't feeling the growth, and, crucially, rising youth unemployment.
Moving into Section 2, governance and youth issues, the generational frustration.
The commentators really emphasize how centralized testing failures have just deeply, deeply angered the youth. Take the NEET UG medical exams, for example. Conducted by the central government, these are incredibly sensitive, yet they were marred by massive paper leak allegations. And it doesn't stop there. National CBSE board exams faced a huge backlash over computerized marking errors. And over in Maharashtra, state-level teacher eligibility tests suffered paper leaks too. The key takeaway here is pretty clear. Because these exams literally determine the future of millions of students, these repeated administrative failures are creating severe frustration. Young people are starting to feel like the government is neglecting education and technology in favor of purely political narratives. And this frustration is totally compounded by the employment data. A survey by the Center for Monitoring Indian Economy, the CMIE, shows that among youth aged 20 to 24, a staggering 60% are unemployed. 60%! That is significantly higher than the national average. The commentators neutrally point out this really stark contrast between these harsh, on-the-ground realities and the grand promises of campaigns like Make in India. Young people they know are just feeling completely left behind.
But how is this affecting the middle class? Well, that brings us to Section 3, the E20 fuel frustration, an economic pinch.
The commentators spend a lot of time on this highly debated ethanol blending issue, and it's a fascinating one. So before 2023, India used E5 and E10 blending. The target mandate for E20, which is 20% ethanol mixed into petrol, was originally set for April 2026. However, reports indicate that the government has drastically rushed this rollout. We are seeing sudden approvals for E100 and E85 fuels happening right now. The analysts argue that this extremely rapid transition is basically leaving everyday consumers absolutely no time to adapt.
And here is exactly why that rush matters. The analysis reveals that 80% of petrol vehicles manufactured in 2022 or earlier are simply not mechanically compliant with E20 fuel. It's the middle and lower middle classes who are really bearing the brunt of this. We're talking dropping mileage, sudden carburetor issues, and increased engine repairs. It's effectively creating a hidden financial penalty for people who can't afford to just, go out and buy a brand new E20 compliant vehicle.
And this brilliantly illustrates an irony pointed out by the sources regarding the whole environmental logic behind this. So the government argues ethanol blending reduces pollution and oil imports. Great, right? Well, actually, ethanol is produced using incredibly water-guzzling crops like corn, rice, and sugarcane. The commentators highlight the profound contradiction of aggressively pushing a policy that requires massive water consumption. Right at the same time, major tech hubs like Bengaluru are facing severe water crises. It's quite the paradox.
Moving along to Section 4, alienating the core base, the disconnection. Our sources showcase a really stark contradiction in the government's rhetoric when it comes to social justice policies. Think back to before the elections. The ruling party actively campaigned against the opposition's demand for a caste census. Top leadership was out there calling it a plot to divide the country and a direct threat to Hindu unity. Yet very shortly after, the government suddenly announced that, actually, it would be conducting a caste census. To the core voter base, the sources argue this felt like an abrupt betrayal of the very ideology they had been loyally voting for. Let's break down how this builds into a broader feeling of reverse discrimination among those core supporters. The commentators walk us through a specific series of recent events. First, state governments push to raise reservation ceilings up to 73% in court affidavits. Second, the University Grants Commission, the UGC, proposed new equity rules in universities mandating reserved category representation on committees, but completely excluded guaranteed representation for the general category. Finally, this created such severe backlash from the party's own supporters and officials that the Supreme Court was forced to step in and issue a stay on those very rules. The underlying analysis here notes that core voters increasingly feel like they're being sacrificed just for broader political appeasement.
All of this alienation really culminates in one striking fact brought up across the analyses. Despite fulfilling its decades-old ultimate promise of building the Ram Mandir in Ayodhya, the ruling party actually lost the Faizabad constituency, which is exactly where Ayodhya is located, in the 2024 elections. The commentators emphasize that this specific, shocking electoral loss is basically the ultimate symbol of the party's current disconnect from its most loyal base.
Finally, we reach Section 5, the shifting global image, the global lens.
For years, the government has projected this aura of being a Vishwaguru, or a supreme world leader. But the commentators map out a pretty stark decline in this perception. Take U.S. relations. The past perception was all about close personal friendships and massive joint rallies. But the current reality? The U.S. is threatening heavy 25% tariffs. Regarding border security, past perceptions are built on strongman, totally independent military responses. Today, sources note border instability where the U.S. has publicly stated it stepped in to mediate. And when it comes to global crises, despite that Vishwaguru title, the evidence suggests there's a distinct lack of backing from key allies right when India needs it the most.
So, the crucial point is this. The creators view the government's foreign policy as actually weakening under international pressure, despite all the massive PR campaigns telling us otherwise. They point to a failure in narrative warfare, arguing that regional rivals are just controlling the global narrative much better than India is right now. They highlight the deafening silence from Quad partners like Australia and Japan during key security operations. They point out the obvious contradiction of boasting an independent foreign policy while still having to rely on U.S. permission for Russian oil imports. And finally, they note the government's lack of a strong, decisive global response during the recent crisis and regime change right next door in Bangladesh. Which leaves us with this final, genuinely provocative thought posed by our commentators. We've looked at the electoral shocks, the youth frustration, the economic pinch of ethanol, the alienation of the core base, and a shifting global image. The ultimate question the sources leave us with is this. Can the ruling party actually recognize these foundational cracks, bridge this growing gap with its voters, and resolve these severe disconnects before the 2029 elections? Or is this the definitive sunset of an era? It's an absolutely fascinating political landscape, and we will undoubtedly be watching closely to see how it all unfolds. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and as always, keep questioning the data.